He was sitting on the opposite bank when I got there in the morning. I didn't think much of it. People fish that lake too. But 4 hours later, he was in the exact same spot, in the exact same position, and he hadn't moved once. Not to stand, not to cast, not to look away. And when the sun started going down, I finally noticed he didn't have a boat. I'd been going to that lake since I was a kid. My uncle had a place about 40 minutes north of the city, deep into the county, and the lake was on the back end of his property. A long walk through second growth pine, down a soft slope that leveled out into a narrow gravel beach on our side. The water was dark and slow and cold even in July. Not a beautiful lake, not the kind you'd find on a postcard, just a wide, quiet piece of water that held decent base and left you alone. My uncle passed a few years back. The property went to my cousin, who lived out of state and had no use for it. I still had a standing invitation to use it whenever I wanted, and I did, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. I never ran into anyone out there. The far side of the lake was dense tree-line with no access road, no trail that I'd ever seen, no sign of cabins or structures. Our side had the walking path from the house. That was it. As far as I could tell, nobody else knew it was there. I went out on a Saturday in late September, drove up the night before and slept at the house, then walked down to the lake at first light with a rod, a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and nothing else planned for the day. The air was cold and thin the way early fall mornings get up there. That specific chill that makes your breath show but isn't quite uncomfortable yet. The gravel crunched under my boots. The lake was flat and silver in the early light. No wind yet, the surface barely moving. I set up in my usual spot, the same flat patch of gravel near the water's edge where a large root from an old pine had pushed up through the bank and made a natural rest for a rod. I poured coffee, cast out, and sat down. The tree line across the water was a dark strip of orange and brown, the leaves just starting to turn. The whole place smelled like cold water and pine needles and nothing else. That's when I saw him for the first time. He was sitting on the opposite bank, about 150 yards across the water, back against the tree line. Dark jacket, light pants, sitting on something low, a log maybe, or a small camp chair. Too far to make out details. I assumed he was fishing. It was a Saturday morning in fall, a reasonable time to be out, and just because I'd never seen anyone over there didn't mean it was impossible. The lake wasn't private. I didn't own it. I noted him the way you note another car in a parking lot you thought was empty. Not alarming, just present. I went back to my coffee in the water and let myself settle into morning. The baits weren't cooperating. I moved my bait twice, changed the setup once, and spent most of the first 2 hours watching the line do nothing. I drank the thermos down to the bottom. The sun came up over the tree line behind me and the lake shifted from silver to a dark green. Around 10 I got a small hit that came to nothing. I stood up to stretch and looked across the water. He was still there, same position, hadn't moved. I told myself it was fine. Some people fish without moving much. That was the whole point of a rod and a holder while you just sit. I'd done it myself. The distance made it hard to read anything specific, and I wasn't going to let someone minding their own business across 150 yards of water ruin my mood. But I kept looking, not constantly, just the way you check something you're trying not to think about. Every 20 minutes or so I'd find my eyes going back across the lake, and every time they did, he was in the same position, back against the tree line, legs extended in front of him, no movement. Around noon I ate the sandwich I'd packed and looked directly at him for a solid minute. Nothing, no rod movement, no shift in posture, no reaching for anything. The wind had picked up enough to push small ripples across the surface, which made it even stranger. It was cold enough that I'd pulled my collar up, and he was just sitting there in a light jacket like the temperature didn't register. I had a pair of small binoculars in my bag. I used them for bird watching when I came out here with my uncle. I hadn't touched them in years, but they were still in the outer pocket where I'd always kept them. I dug them out and trained them across the water. The image was blurry at first. I adjusted the focus until the far bank sharpened. He was a man, that much I could tell. The jacket was dark green, not black like I thought. His face was angled slightly downward, which from that distance made it impossible to see his eyes clearly. He was sitting on something, what looked like a small folding stool. No fishing rod that I could see. No bag, no cooler, no equipment of any kind. Just a man in the stool and the tree line behind him. I lowered the binoculars. No rod. He wasn't fishing. I started assembling reasons. He was resting. He'd come out for a walk and stopped. He was bird watching like I used to. He was meeting someone who hadn't arrived yet. None of them explained why he'd been in the exact same position for 4 hours without any observable movement. I packed the binoculars away and focused on the water. By 2 in the afternoon, the light had shifted and the surface had gone flat again. I caught one small bass, threw it back. The cold was settling in earlier than I expected, the way it does in the valley when clouds start coming in the north. I looked across the lake. He was still there. I stood up from the chair and stretched and looked for a long moment. Same position. I tried to logic through the whole thing one more time and couldn't. The discomfort I'd been managing all day finally stopped letting itself be managed. I thought about the far bank. The tree line over there was dense, old growth mixed with scrub brush. No clear path through it that I'd ever seen from this side. The lake was roughly oval, maybe a quarter-mile end to end and slightly less across. The shoreline on the far side had no gradual entry to the water. It went from tree line to steep bank, maybe 3 feet of drop into the water. You couldn't walk around the lake's perimeter. The north end was swamp and the south end was a rocky spillway from when the county had dammed the original stream decades ago. To get to the far bank, you needed a boat. There was no boat. I raised the binoculars again, steadied them, found him in the frame. He was looking at me. I couldn't see it clearly. The distance was still too far for that kind of detail, but the angle of his head had changed. It was up now, directed across the water, toward where I was standing. I lowered the binoculars slowly. The reasonable part of my brain said, he just looked up. People look up. This doesn't mean any. The other part of my brain, the part that had been quietly uncomfortable for 4 hours, said he's been watching you this whole time and you couldn't tell because his head was angled down just enough to hide it. I sat back down. My hands weren't steady when I picked up the thermos and found it empty. The afternoon light started going gold and flat, the way it does an hour before sunset in the fall. Shadows pushed up from the tree line on both sides of the lake. The temperature dropped noticeably. I usually stayed until dark on days like this, but I wasn't thinking about that any. I looked across the water. He was standing, same spot, same tree line, but upright now, for the first time all day, facing directly across the lake. I didn't move. He raised one hand, not a wave, not the back and forth motion of a greeting, just a slow lift, deliberate, like an acknowledgement, like he was confirming that he'd seen me, that he'd been seeing me, that we both knew it now. Then he turned and walked into the tree line and was gone. I sat there for a moment without moving. The lake was quiet. The wind had died down. From somewhere in the trees behind me, something shifted, a branch, an animal, just the wood settling in the cold. I turned around fast. Nothing there. I looked back across the water. The far bank was empty. The spot where he'd been sitting showed nothing. No indentation in the brush. No mark in the dirt. Nothing I could see from this distance. I started packing, not slowly. I broke down the rod without wiping it, shoved the chair into its bag half folded, grabbed the empty thermos in my jacket and started walking back up the slope toward the house. The gravel under my boots sounded too loud. The path through the pines was narrow enough that I had to walk single file and I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. The house was empty. I'd left it locked. I checked every room before I sat down. I didn't go back to the lake that evening. I told myself I would, that I'd shake it off, make dinner, maybe walk down at dusk and see if there was any sign of who he was or how he'd gotten it. I didn't. I sat in the kitchen with the lights on and the doors locked and ate something I barely tasted. Before I drove home the next morning, I walked down to the lake one more time. I wanted to see the far bank in daylight, clear-headed, without the weight of 4 hours of watching. I stood at the water's edge and trained the binoculars across. The spot was visible. The low brush where he'd been sitting was partially flattened, pressed down in a rough outline of something that had been there for a long time. The ground around it was dark, almost muddy, despite the rest of the bank looking dry. And in the mud, at the edge of where the bank dropped down to the water, there were marks. I couldn't tell from across the lake exactly what they were. Impressions of some kind, close to the water. The angle was wrong and the distance was too far. But they were there and they were recent and they went right to the edge of the water and not back into the tree line. Not footprints walking back. Footprints going in. I stood with the binoculars down and looked at the flat, dark surface of the lake for a while. Nothing moved. The water gave nothing back. My cousin called while I was driving. He asked how the trip was, whether the base were biting. The usual check-in. I told him it was fine. I didn't mention the man on the far bank. I didn't mention the boat that wasn't there or the hand raised at dusk or the prints at the edge of the water. I don't know what I would have said. I still don't. What I keep coming back to is hand. That slow, deliberate raise. Not a greeting. Something else. Like marking the end of something. Like he'd been doing something all day and was letting me know it was finished. I don't know what he was doing. I don't know how he got there or how he left or what those marks at the water's edge. I don't know if he was watching me specifically or if I just happened to be there. I went back once more, about a month later. The flattened brush on the far bank had grown back enough that I couldn't find the exact spot. The mud at the waterline had dried and cracked and told me nothing. I still go out there. I still fish the same spot. But I don't stay past dark anymore, and I keep the binoculars in my lap now instead of in the bag. I haven't seen him again. I don't know if that's a good thing or not.